The Veriverol clock struck 11 that morning, and for the first time in 40 years of my keeping it, the 11th stroke came a half-beat too soon. I heard it the way a man hears his own name spoken behind him in an empty room. I was on the gallery above the long hall, oilcloth in one hand, the little three-cornered key to the regulator door in the other, and I stopped with my arm half raised. The strokes rolled out under the painted ceiling, bronze and patient, the way they had rolled out across the reign of 3 sovereigns of the House of Marin. 1, 2, 3. I counted them as I always did, not because I needed to, but because counting them was a kind of prayer I had said so long I no longer noticed saying it. And on the 11th, the hammer fell a hair ahead of where my heart expected it, and a coldness went down the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the draft off the marble. A clock cannot lie. That is the whole of my creed, the thing I have believed since I was a boy apprenticed to old Hessler with my hands always cold and always cut. A man lies. A ledger lies. A smiling face across a table lies as easily as it breathes. But a clock is iron and brass and the patient arithmetic of a falling weight, and it tells you exactly and only the truth, unless someone has been inside it, moving things that were never meant to be moved. I stood very still on the gallery and let the silence come back. Below me the long hall stretched 200 feet under its vaulted ceiling, all gilded plaster and old gold, and at the far end, where the morning light came slanting through the tall windows, stood the great Veriverol automaton clock that was the heart of the palace, and the reason I had a name and a station, and a small set of rooms behind the kitchens. 11 feet of ebony and ormolu and crystal. A face of white enamel ringed in a band of cut sapphires that caught the light like a king's collar. And below the face, behind a panel of beveled glass, the procession, 12 little figures of gilt bronze and enamel who came out at each hour on a turning track, a huntsman, a falconer, a shepherdess, a knight, a queen with a crown of seed pearls and bowed and turned and went back into the dark. I had wound that clock with my own hands every 8th day for 40 years. I knew its voice the way a shepherd knows one sheep's bleat in 1,000, and its voice that morning was wrong. I came down the gallery stair too fast for a man of my age and crossed the long hall, and the guard at the door of it turned his head a quarter-inch to mark me, and then was a statue again. I should tell you about the guard, because he is the whole of this in the end, and I am only the man who counted the strokes. His name was Aldous Brenner, and he had stood the inner watch of the long hall for 6 years. The hall guard is a strange post. It is not the gate, where the tourists gather and the cameras flock and a young man can feel himself admired. It is an interior post, a quiet one, a long gleaming room that the public sees only on the 4 open days of the year, and the rest of the time it is the clock and the gold and one soldier in a scarlet tunic standing his 2-hour reliefs in a silence so deep you can hear the weights descend in their shaft. Most young men ask to be moved off it within a season. They cannot bear the stillness. Brenner had never asked. He stood it the way other men breathe, and in 6 years I had come to think of him less as a soldier set there to guard a clock and more as a second clock himself. A tall one in red wool and a black bearskin, keeping his own kind of time. We were not friends. The keeper of the clocks and the guard of the hall do not, by the customs of the house, speak idly. But across 6 years a man learns another man without words. I knew that he stood his left foot a half-inch forward of his right because of an old hurt he never named. I knew that on the coldest mornings he would close his eyes for the length of one breath when he thought no one watched, and open them, and be iron again. And he knew me, knew the slow circuit I made of the hall each morning, the oilcloth, the 3-cornered key, the way I laid my palm flat against the clock's case before I opened it, as a man lays a hand on the flank of a horse he loves. So when I crossed the hall that morning faster than my custom, and stopped before the great clock, and did not lay my hand flat on the case but only stood and stared up at the sapphire ring as though it had spoken to me, I felt rather than saw the guard's attention sharpen. He did not move. He was far too disciplined to move. But the quality of his stillness changed. the way the air changes before weather, and I understood that he had marked the wrongness in me exactly as I had marked it in the clock. I opened the lower case and looked at the going train, the great brass wheels turning their ancient turn, and at first I saw nothing. The mainspring barrel was sound. The fusee chain ran true. The escapement ticked its tick. I crouched there a long while with my heart going hard, telling myself I was an old fool who had miscounted a stroke, that 40 years had finally worn a hole in my ear. And then I looked at the pendulum. The pendulum of the Varavelle clock is a thing of beauty and of weight. A long rod of polished steel ending in a great lens-shaped bob, and set into the face of that bob, since the clock was made, a single emerald the size of a thrush's egg, cut flat, that the maker had placed there for no reason but that he could, a green eye swinging in the dark of the case, 2 seconds out and 2 seconds back forever. The emerald was still there. It swung as it had always swung, but the light did not move in it the way it should. I have looked into that stone 10,000 times. A cut emerald, when the light crosses it, does a particular thing. It holds the light and lets it go in a slow, deep green, the way deep water does. This stone caught the light and threw it back too quick and too bright, a hard, glassy flash, the way paste does. The way glass does, cut to look like a king's emerald by a hand that knew its trade. I knelt there in the open case of the clock I had kept for 40 years, and I understood 3 things in the space of one breath. The emerald in the pendulum was not the emerald. The half-beat in the 11th stroke was the clock running a hair fast, because its pendulum bob now weighed a few grains less than it had, glass being lighter than the stone it replaced. And someone, in the 4 weeks since the great clock had been closed up for its restoration, and handed to the care of a man not me, had been quietly taking the palace apart from the inside, one jewel at a time, and putting back glass. I closed the case very gently, as you would close a door on a sleeping house, and I stood, and I found that the guard Brenner was looking at me. Not turned. He would never have turned his head from his front on duty, but his eyes had come round to the limit of their travel, and they were fixed on my face, and in them was a question. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. Say nothing. And I walked out of the long hall with my hands steady and my mind a storm, because I knew now what I had heard in the 11th stroke, and I did not yet know whom in the palace I could tell. The man I would have told in any ordinary month was the controller of the household, a dry, careful gentleman named Severance, who had held the palace's purse strings for 20 years, and to whom every theft and breakage and lost spoon was reported. But the trouble was not ordinary, and the man who had brought the trouble into the palace was a man the controller had brought there himself. His name was Master Quill. He had arrived a month before, with letters of introduction so handsome they might have been gilt, a horologist and a goldsmith both, a restorer of great clocks who had, the letters said, set right the famous astronomical orrery of a foreign court, and rebuilt the carillon of a cathedral I had heard of but never seen. He was a small, neat man of perhaps 50, with a voice like warm oil and hands so clean they seemed never to have touched anything, which I marked the first day, because a clockman's hands are never clean. Mine are stained to the cuticle with the black of old oil and brass rouge, and have been since I was 12. The Varavelle clock, the letters said, was 400 years old and tired. Its strike was uncertain, which it was not, until he came near it. Its train wanted repivoting, and its case wanted refinishing, and its jeweled face, that band of sapphires and that great emerald and the rubies in the little crowns of the procession, wanted lifting and cleaning and resetting by a master, because a stone half a degree loose in its collet would in time work free and be lost. All of which was true. All of which was the kind of work that any honest restorer does, and that I myself was too old and too far out of the goldsmith's craft to do, my trade being the movement and not the jewels. So the controller had given Master Quill the clock, not taken it from me, that is too hard a word, but set the two of us side by side, the keeper and the restorer, and told me kindly enough that Master Quill would have the use of the locked workroom behind the long hall for as long as the work took, and that I was to give him every assistance and not to trouble myself with the parts of the work that were beyond my craft. I had not liked it. But the letters were handsome, and the controller was satisfied, and a man does not refuse the cleaning of a 400-year-old clock because he does not care for the cleaner's clean hands. Now I stood in the corridor outside the long hall with the knowledge of glass for emerald sitting in me like a swallowed stone, and I made myself think the thing through coldly, the way you think through a fault in a movement, not from the symptom, but from the cause. A loose stone resets in an afternoon. Master Quill had been at the clock 4 weeks, and the work was not half done, or so he said with that warm oil voice whenever the controller asked. 4 weeks to lift and clean a band of stones is the work of a man who is not lifting and cleaning them at all, but doing something slower and quieter, taking each stone out, weighing it, sending it away to be sold, to be cut down, to vanish into the river of the world's jewel markets where no stone has a name, and cutting a glass paste to the shape of it, and a paste so good that only the clock itself, running a half-beat fast on a pendulum a few grains light, would ever betray him. And by the time the work was finished, and the case closed, and Master Quill bowed out of the palace with his handsome letters and his clean hands, the great Verivel clock would stand exactly as it had always stood, and every true stone in it would be glass, and the wealth of a house would be 3 months gone across some border, and no man the wiser until some far-off day when another keeper, another count of the strokes, heard the wrongness too late to name the thief. It was beautifully done. I will say that for him now, across all the years. It was the work of a man who understood that the safest place to hide a theft is inside the very thing whose business is to tell the truth. I did not go to the controller. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that the controller had vouched for the man, and a dry, careful gentleman who has vouched for a thief does not thank the servant who proves him a fool. He finds reasons the servant is mistaken. Part of it was that I had no proof a court would hear, 1 stone, 1 half-beat, the ear of 1 old man. And part of it, the part I am least proud of, was fear. Fear that if I spoke too soon and was wrong, I would end 40 years as the addled keeper who cried thief against a great restorer, and be pensioned off to a cottage to count the strikes of a kitchen clock until I died. So instead I did the foolish brave thing, which was to go and look. The locked workroom behind the long hall had been mine once before it was his. There was a second key. There had always been a second key since old Hessler's day, kept in the back of the long case regulator on the gallery where no one but a keeper of the clocks would ever think to look. Master Quill did not know of it. Why would he? He knew clocks the way a surgeon knows a body, to cut and to take. He did not know them the way I knew them, as houses I had lived in. That night, when the palace had gone down into its sleep, and the corridors were lit only by the low gas lamps the night watch kept, I took the second key from the back of the regulator and went down to the workroom door. And there, I had my first true fright, because the guard of the long hall was not gone for the night as I had thought he would be. Brenner was at his post. He should not have been. The inner watch stood down at the 11th hour, and the hall was given over to the night patrol that walked the whole floor. But there he stood in the dark of the long hall, no longer in the scarlet but in the plain dark undressed tunic of a guardsman off the ceremonial roster, at ease against the cold, and his eyes found me in the gloom before I had taken 3 steps. I froze with the second key warm in my fist, and my heart going like a loose escapement. "You heard it too," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, a voice that had spent 6 years learning never to carry. "This morning, the 11th stroke." I had never heard him say so many words at once. I had, I realized, barely heard him speak at all. "You count them," he said when I did not answer. "Every morning, I've watched you do it for 6 years, your lips move, and this morning on the 11th you stopped." He let that sit. Then very quietly, "I count them too. There is not much else to do on this post but count, And this morning the 11th came early. I thought it was me. I thought 6 years of standing still had finally cracked something in my head. A pause. It wasn't me, was it? And I understood that I was not alone, and had not been alone since the bronze hammer fell a half-beat too soon, and that the second man who had heard the clock lie was the one man in the palace whose whole life was the keeping of a truth he was forbidden to speak aloud. "No," I said, "it wasn't you. Come and see." I will tell you what stayed my hand a moment at the workroom door with the second key against the lock. It was the oath of the thing. Brenner's whole worth as a soldier was that he stood his post and did not leave it, and did not act on his own judgment in the king's house, but only on the order of those set over him. And here was I, an old man with a stolen key, asking him to step away from the very discipline that made him what he was, to creep about a locked room at midnight on the word of a count of strokes. I half expected him to refuse. It would have been the correct thing. It would have been the safe thing. He did not refuse. He looked at me a moment in the gaslight, and something moved behind that still face, not eagerness, nothing so cheap, a kind of grave decision, a man settling a weight more comfortably onto a shoulder already used to weight. "My post is the hall," he said, "and the clock is the hall. If the clock is being robbed, then I am being robbed of the thing I was set to guard." He stepped back from the wall and stood square. "Open it." So I opened it. The workroom smelled of pitch and shellac and the particular Swedish reek of jeweler's cement, and under it, faint, the smell of the small spirit lamp a goldsmith uses. Master Quill kept it neat as his hands. The great workbench ran the length of one wall, and on it, under a square of green baize, lay the tools of two trades. The clockman's that I knew, the pivot files and the bench key and the little brass calipers, and the goldsmiths that I knew only well enough to fear, the gravers and the collet pushers and the pitch bowl, and in a fitted case lined with chamois, the loops. Brenner took the lamp I had brought and held it steady while I went over the bench, and at first there was nothing to find. A neat man hides his work, but a clockman knows where a clockman hides things, because we hide them in the same kind of places, inside the cases of things, behind the works, in the hollow you would never open unless you were looking for the hollow. I found it in the regulator clock that stood in the corner of the workroom, a plain shop regulator, a bench clock of no value, that Master Quill kept, he had said, to set his work against. I opened its case as I would open any clock, and behind the pendulum in the dustboard at the back, there was a panel that did not belong to that clock. I knew it did not belong because I knew that clock. It was an old shop piece, a Hessler piece, and I had set its dustboard myself 30 years before, and the dustboard I had set was one plain board, and this was a board with a sliding panel let into it by a clever recent hand. I slid it, and behind it was a flat tin box, and in the box, wrapped each in a twist of soft paper, were the stones. I laid them out on the green baize in the lamplight, and Brenner held the lamp, and neither of us spoke. There were 19 of them, sapphires from the great ring of the face. I counted the empty paste-set collets in my mind and knew there should be more, that he was not yet half done, that this was a month's harvest and there were 2 months of harvest yet to come. 4 rubies, prized from the little crowns of the bronze procession, the queens and the knights among them. And by itself in a fold of black silk, as though it were the chief of them, which it was, the great flat emerald the size of a thrush's egg, the green eye that had swung in the dark of the clock for 400 years, that had watched 3 rains swing past 2 seconds out and 2 seconds back, lying now cold and dead and stolen in a tin box in a thief's clever clock. Brenner looked at it a long time. Then he said in that low, even voice, "Put them back." I thought I had misheard him. Back. In the box, in the panel, as they were. He had not raised his voice at all, but there was iron under it now, the first I had heard. "If we take them tonight, what have we? 2 men who broke into a locked room. He will say we put the stones there. He has handsome letters and clean hands and the controller's good word, and we have a stolen key and a midnight and a grudge, for that is what they will call it, The old keepers grudge against the man who took his clock. They will believe him and not us, and the stones will be his to lose again the moment we are turned out of the palace. No. He set the lamp down and looked at me steadily across it. We do not take the thief's prize. We let the thief reach for it in front of men who cannot disbelieve their own eyes. I am not too proud to tell you that the soldier saw in one cold minute what the clockman had not seen in a day of fretting. I had been thinking like a man who keeps a clock, find the fault, take it out, set it right, close the case. He was thinking like a man who keeps a post, that the proof is not in your hand, but in the moment when the wrong is done where it cannot be denied. Then what? I said. When does he finish? Brenner asked. He must mean to finish. The work cannot run forever. The controller will tire of it. There will be a day he closes the case for good, makes his bow, and carries the last of the true stones out of the palace in his coat. When? I thought, the clock is to be shown at the Founder's Day in 9 days. The hall open to the household and the court. The clock running, the procession turning, the whole of it on display. It is the oldest ceremony of the house. He will want it closed and gleaming and finished by then, so that he may stand beside it in the hall and be praised, and take his leave the next morning with the last stones on him, and the whole court for his witness that the great clock is safe and whole. I heard my own voice go thin. He will rob the house in the 1 week the house is watching, and be thanked for it. Then we have 9 days, Brenner said, to make a thing the whole court is watching tell the truth about the man standing beside it. The ghost of something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. You said it yourself. A clock cannot lie. We put the stones back. We slid the panel home. We left the workroom as we had found it, and I locked it, and I put the second key back in the regulator on the gallery, and we parted in the dark without another word, 2 old keepers of 2 old truths, with 9 days and no plan but the clock between us and the quiet ruin of the house we served. And the next morning, exactly at the breakfast hour, Master Quill came to find me warm-voiced, clean-handed, smiling, and asked, ever so pleasantly, whether I had been sleeping badly, because one of the night patrol had thought he saw a light very late in the long hall. I had spent 40 years learning to keep my face as still as the things I tended, and I was grateful for every one of those years in that moment. I sleep little, I said, an old man and an old habit. I walk the hall when I cannot sleep. It comforts me to hear the clock. All of it true, and none of it the truth, which is the only safe kind of lie to tell a clever man. He held my eyes a beat longer than a pleasant man holds them. Then the warmth came back over his face like oil over water. It is a great comfort, a clock in the dark, he agreed. I shall have it gleaming for you by the Founder's Day. You will hardly know your old friend. And he went away, neat and small and certain, and I understood that he was certain of nothing now, which made him the more dangerous, because a thief who is sure of his work grows careless, and a thief who has begun to wonder grows quick. I told Brenner that evening, in the 1 minute we had as I made my dusk circuit of the hall, and he stood his last relief. He suspects, I said low, not looking at him, looking at the clock. Then we change nothing, Brenner said, equally low, looking at his front. A man who suspects watches for a change. We give him none. You count your strokes. I stand my post. He finishes his work. And on the Founder's Day the trap is the clock itself, and he walks into it because he must, because he cannot finish without setting the last false stones, and he cannot leave without the true ones. A pause, while a footman crossed the far end of the hall and was gone. Tell me how a clock can be made to accuse a man. So over the next 8 days, in stolen minutes and in the long nights, I built the thing. And I will tell it to you plainly, because the cleverness of it is not mine to be vain of. It came out of the craft, the way all my best things have, the clock teaching me what it wanted to do. The Verivel clock struck the hours on its great bell, and at noon and at midnight it did more. At those 2 hours the procession came out, the 12 gilt figures on their turning track, and the clock played on a nest of tuned bells, the old air of the house of Marin. a slow grave tune that every soul at court had heard since the cradle. The playing was worked by a pinned barrel, a brass cylinder set with hundreds of little steel pins, that turned once at noon and once at midnight and let the pins pluck the bell hammers in their order. Change a pin and you change a note. Add a pin and you add a note where none was. The barrel was the clock's memory, and its memory could be edited by any hand that knew where the pins went. And there was no hand alive that knew that barrel better than mine, who had cleaned and repinned it twice across 40 years. I did not change the tune. The tune was sacred. To foul it would have been a small blasphemy, and worse, it would have warned him. What I did was quieter. I added at the very end of the noon air, after the last grave note, in the half-second of silence before the procession turned back into the dark, a single new stroke. One pin, set alone. A small high bell, the smallest in the nest, that the clock had never in 400 years been made to ring. One clear note like a question, in the silence after the tune. It meant nothing. It was nothing, a grace note, a flaw, a thing a careless ear would let pass and a sharp ear would frown at and forget. But I knew, and Brenner knew, what it was. It was a bell that could only ring if a man had opened the clock that very day, and the barrel had been turned past its true seating by a hair, which it would be on the Founder's Day, because Master Quill would have to open the case that morning to set his last false stones and close it gleaming for the court. And in closing it, he would seat the barrel, and my single pin, that he could not see and did not know to look for, would come round at noon and ring the one note the clock had never rung. And that note was the signal. That was all the clock could do. It could not name the thief. It could not open his coat. But it could tell two waiting men the exact half-second to act, in a hall full of the whole court, so that the act fell not on suspicion but on certainty. The rest Brenner built, and it was the harder half, because it was the half that risked his name and his post and his honor on a single throw. He went 3 days before the Founder's Day to his own officer, not to the controller who had vouched for the thief, but up his own line, soldier to soldier, to the captain of the inner watch, a hard, fair man named Voss who had soldiered 30 years and owed no debt to Master Quill or his handsome letters. Brenner did not tell Captain Voss that the great clock was being robbed. He had no proof to lay before a captain, and a captain cannot act on a guardsman's hunch any more than a controller can. What Brenner told him was smaller and truer and exactly enough. That he, Brenner, had reason, which he would answer for with his post if he were wrong, to ask that on the Founder's Day the restorer, Master Quill, be quietly searched at the door of the long hall as he left, before he quit the palace. Nothing more. A search at the door. And that if there were nothing on the man, then Brenner would take whatever discipline the asking earned him, and ask nothing else ever again. It was, you understand, his whole career laid on the table. A guardsman does not accuse a guest of the house. A guardsman who is wrong about it does not stand the inner watch again, nor any watch. He is broken back to the depot or out the gate. Brenner knew that to the bone, and he laid it down anyway in that flat, even voice, looking the captain in the eye. And Captain Voss, who had 30 years' habit of reading men, looked back at the one soldier on the whole roster who had never once asked off the loneliest post in the palace, and heard the steadiness in him, and said, "Brenner told me this after, and his voice was not quite steady when he told it. I have watched you stand that hall for 6 years, Brenner, and you have never asked me for one thing. I will give you your search at the door. If you are wrong, we will speak of it then." And he asked nothing more. So it was said. The single pin in the barrel, the search at the door, the noon of the Founder's Day, with the whole court in the long hall and the great clock gleaming and the small high bell waiting to ring its one impossible note. 8 days of work, 2 old keepers and 1 thief who came each morning to ask after my sleep, warm-voiced, clean-handed and certain now of nothing at all. Which is how, on the 8th night, the last night, he very nearly undid the whole of it. I came down to the hall near midnight for my last look at the barrel, to be sure my single pin sat true. I had a lamp, and I had my key to the hall door, and I had no thought of danger, because a man building a trap forgets that the other man is building one too. The hall was dark. The clock ticked its great slow tick. And as I crossed to the case I saw, by the low gas lamp at the far end, that the lower panel of the clock, the going train door that I had closed myself that morning, stood open a finger's width. He was inside the case. Master Quill rose up out of the dark of the clock like a thing the clock had made, and the lamp shook in my hand, and the light ran over his clean hands and over the little case of loops open on the floor and over the open back of the pinned barrel which he had drawn out of its seating to clean it. He would have said, on the eve of the Founder's Day, the last good polish before the court came. But his eyes were not a craftsman's eyes. They had gone flat and quick, and they went from my face to the barrel and back, and I knew in the cold that went down me that he had found my pin. A goldsmith counts. A man who has set hundreds of his own pins of glass into a clock's face will count the pins of a barrel out of long habit, and he had counted, and there was one more than there should be, set apart alone, where no heir of the house had ever needed it. "Keeper," he said softly, "what is this small bell for?" The whole of it hung on that breath. If I lied and he did not believe me, he would lift my pin out in a moment and my trap would be a dead thing. And the Founder's Day would come, and the search at the door would find a man with nothing on him, because a warned thief carries nothing, and Brenner would be broken for a false alarm, and I would be the addled keeper after all, and the stones would go out of the palace some other quiet day with no one left to hear them go. So I did not lie. I have wondered since whether it was courage or only that I was too old and too tired to find a lie fast enough. I set my lamp on the bench, and I looked at him across the open heart of the clock I had kept for 40 years, and I said, "It is for you." He went very still. "I know what is in the regulator in your workroom," I said. 19 stones and a great emerald in a tin box behind a panel a clever hand led into a dustboard I set 30 years ago. I know the 11th stroke ran fast the morning you weighed your work too light. I know the pendulum throws glass light, not stone light. I have known for 9 days. My voice did not shake, and I was glad of it. I could not prove it to the controller who gave you the clock. I could not prove it to a court. So I gave it to the one witness that cannot be bribed and cannot be doubted and cannot be afraid of you. I gave it to the clock. At noon tomorrow, in front of the whole court, the clock will ring one note it has never rung, and tell every soul in the hall the exact moment that a thief has had his hands inside it that very day. That is what the small bell is for. You may lift my pin out now if you like. But you cannot unknow that I will be standing beside the controller at noon, telling him to listen for it. And you cannot finish your work without opening this case in the morning, and you cannot leave without the stones. And there is a soldier at the door of this hall who would lay down his life sooner than let you carry them past him. It was the longest speech of my life, and the most dangerous, and I made it to a thief alone in the dark with a graver within reach of his clean right hand. For a moment something ugly came up in his face. Then it was gone, smoothed away, and he smiled, and the warm oil came back into his voice. "You are a romantic, Keeper, an old man and his old clock. Who will believe a bell? I will tell them the bell is a fault of age, and you the fault that let it ring, and by the time they have done arguing I shall be 3 boarders gone." He bent, unhurried, to lift my pin. And the voice came from the dark of the hall, low and even and absolutely without fear. "Step away from the clock." Brenner had been at his post. Of course he had. He had stood his last relief and stayed on in the dark in his undressed tunic as he had done every night of the 9, because the clock was the hall and the hall was his, and a man does not leave the thing he is set to guard on the night before the danger comes to it. He had heard the whole of it. And now he came up the long hall out of the gloom, unhurried, exactly as a clock comes to the hour, and he was between Master Quill and the door before the thief had straightened. "You will not lift that pin," Brenner said, "and you will not leave this hall tonight. You may sit there on the bench until the morning watch comes, or you may try the door." He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He only stood square, his left foot a half-inch forward of his right, 6 years of stillness gathered into one unmovable man between a thief and the dark. I have stood this post a long time, Master Quill. I am very good at not moving. Try the door and learn how good. The thief looked at the door. He looked at the soldier in front of it. And whatever he saw in that still scarlet-less figure, whatever it is that men finally see, the thing the bearskin and the tunic only point at, it took the certainty out of him all at once, the way the light goes out of false glass. He sat down on the bench. He did not lift my pin. We stood the three of us through the dark hours, the thief on the bench and the soldier at the door and the old keeper beside his clock, and the great Verivel clock ticked its slow tick around us and struck the small hours one by one, true on every stroke. And at the gray turn of the dawn the morning watch came and Captain Voss with them, 2 hours early, because Brenner had sent the night runner for him the moment I had named the small bell aloud. There was no need, in the end, for the noon and the court and the single ringing pin. The trap I had built was never sprung, and I have made my peace with that. A thing built true does its work even when it is never used by being there. Captain Voss heard it all in the gray light from me and from Brenner, and then he sent 2 men to the workroom, and they came back with the tin box, and Voss opened the twists of soft paper one by one on the green baize while the thief sat gray-faced on the bench, and there were the sapphires, and the 4 rubies, and in its fold of black silk the great flat emerald the size of a thrush's egg, cold and dead and found. Master Quill went out of the palace that morning, but not with the stones, and not by the door he had meant. The handsome letters proved, when the court's men wrote to the courts that had supposedly written them, to be as false as his glass. He had set right no orrery and rebuilt no carillon. He had robbed 2 great houses before ours in exactly this way, the safe, slow way, hiding the theft inside the very thing whose business was the truth, and had only ever been caught this once. The controller, the dry, careful gentleman who had vouched for him, did not thank me, but he did not need to. He stood a long while before the great clock that day, with the case open and the false stones plain in their collets beside the recovered true ones, and he was a man who had looked into a pit he had very nearly walked into, and he said only to me, quietly, I should have listened to the keeper of the clocks, which is as near an apology as a controller comes, and was enough. It took me 3 weeks to set the true stones home again, slowly, with a young goldsmith from the city watching my hands, for the jewels were past my own craft, and I knew it, and I am not too proud to say so. That much, at least, Master Quill had spoken true. But I seated the great emerald in the pendulum bob myself. I would let no other hand do it. I set the green eye back into the dark of the case where it had swung for 400 years, and I closed the case, and I started the clock, and I stood on the gallery the next morning with my oilcloth and my 3-cornered key, and I counted the strokes. 11, and the 11th fell exactly where my heart expected it, true to the half-beat, true as it had been true through 3 rains, and the coldness that had lived in the back of my neck for a month went out of me all at once, and I confess, I had to set my hand flat on the cool case of the clock and stand so a while. Brenner kept the inner watch of the long hall for 11 more years, until his knee gave out at last and he was pensioned with honor, and Captain Voss saw to it that the pension was a good one. He never told the story. I never told it either while he lived. It was not ours to tell but the house's, and the house keeps its quiet. But I will tell you now the one thing I learned standing beside that man through the dark hours of the longest night of my life, the thing I had kept a clock 40 years without quite understanding. I had always believed a clock cannot lie. I believed it still. But I learned that a clock left to itself can be made to keep a lie better than any tongue, that the truth in a thing is only as safe as the men who keep watch over it. The clock heard the theft, but the clock could not stand between the thief and the door. It took a man for that. It took a man who had spent 6 silent years learning to be as steady and as patient and as unmovable as the great machine he guarded, so that when the hour came that the thing he kept needed more than keeping, needed a man to step out of the dark and stand square and say, "Step away." There was such a man, and he did not move, and he did not break, and he held. That is the truest clock I ever knew, and I counted strokes still.